Shalom Havarim. It is a tremendous honor to be here, and I want to say at the outset, on my behalf, but tonight is just as much not just about me, but about our entire government and about two groups of people. First and foremost, it's about the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And second, it's about a remarkable team of people who have got behind him over the years, especially the team that I'm so privileged to work with in the House of Commons, and two of my colleagues who've made such an outstanding difference to Canada with their leadership. And I'm talking about my good friends, Joe Oliver and Mark Adler. Finally, we have a Jew in our caucus. I have a formal speech, but I thought I might just speak from the heart tonight. I want to tell you what a great honor this is. The Prime Minister's leadership, what our government is all about, is standing up for our values, standing up for our principles, standing up for everything that made our country great. And Mr. Picard spoke about Queen's University, my alma mater, the other place I have a degree from. I want to tell you a great story about Queen's. Queen's has a reputation of being a very Anglo-Saxon Protestant university, which were its basis, which were the way it was founded. And I have, over the years, gone out of my way to encourage young conservatives to consider attending Queen's University. And I have three students who've worked in my office who were young Jews who eventually went on to study at Queen's University. I want to tell you a great story about Canada, about Queen's University, and about the Jewish community. When I graduated from Queen's, went to work in Ottawa for the Minister of Communications. At that time, the Minister of Communications was responsible for arts and culture and heritage. And the minister had a meeting with a gentleman by the name of Alfred Bader and his lovely wife, Isabel. And Alfred traveled all the way from Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Ottawa to push the federal government to make a grant to Queen's University for an arts center. And he was prepared to put up a third of the money to build such an arts center, very generous contribution, and prepared to donate, which he already has, his entire collection of old Dutch master paintings. And Alfred loves Queen's. When he left Europe in the late 1940s and came to Canada and was looking for a start in his life after a particularly difficult period, he came to Canada and couldn't get into some universities because at that time, you see, they had a terrible thing called a Jew quota. And he couldn't get in at McGill, he couldn't get in at the U of T, but he got in at Queen's because Queen's had no such quota. And he got a great education and graduated, was not able to marry the girl that he loved, Isabel, because he was Jewish. And I'll advance forward many years. 30 years later, he eventually was able to marry his girlfriend Isabel in his second marriage and was able to try to return the favor that Queen's University and that Canada had given him. After graduating university, he had moved to the United States and set up a business where he was very, very successful, a chemical company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And Alfred Bader traveled all the way from Milwaukee to meet the Minister of Communications to push for funding for a building at Queen's University. And he was in the lobby waiting to meet the minister, and the Prime Minister calls. It's an emergency. He needs to see the minister immediately. It's 1992, so the minister couldn't meet with him, and this poor fellow, this poor chap, generous, had traveled all the way to Milwaukee for nothing. But he got a meeting with the minister's young 22-year-old kid, a student, assistant. So I sat down and met with Alfred and Isabel Bader, tremendously modest people, tremendously humble people who had been very, very financially successful in their life. And they pushed this great art center in Kingston, Ontario at Queen's University. And I listened and I watched. And I said I would report back to the minister in due course. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. No building, no grant, nothing. He invited me to a lecture that he gave at the National Art Gallery, where I learned about all of his escapades as an art collector and a chemist. And they didn't get the building. Nothing happened. Nothing went forward. Well, some 20 years later, I'm on a plane from Toronto to Ottawa just after the 2008 election, and I have the Vice President of Queen's sitting beside me. And he says, you know what, we've got this great project we're pushing. An art center for Kingston. We have this American investor who's prepared to put up a third of the cost if the province and the federal government will put up their third, and he'll give his entire art collection to Queen's University, and Queen's would have one of the 5 best art collections anywhere in Canada. I said, really? So, well, I'm not sure what I can do, but give me a call. I picked up the Globe and Mail, which had been in my briefcase that morning, and it was a 2 o'clock flight. I remember it very succinctly. It was a 2 o'clock flight, landing at 3, and I had a meeting with the Prime Minister at 4. And it was a week after the election. And I read the Globe and Mail, and it said that I was going to be appointed the Minister of Infrastructure. And how excited I was 3 months later to announce the Isabel Bader Art Center at Queen's University, funded by this great man who got such a great start in Canada. And that's my association with Queen's University, and one of my introductions to the Jewish community, which made me so proud to be a Canadian. I'm often asked, what is my focus? How did I become interested in the state of Israel? Why am I such a passionate supporter? Obviously, we have people like Mark Adler and Joe Oliver and the strong leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, but I worked for a gentleman by the name of Perrin Beatty. He went on to become foreign minister for the entire Campbell government, all 4.5 months of it. And we were sitting around a briefing room one morning getting a briefing about what was going on in the world, and they reported to us that it was raining in a city called Metula, a city I would later visit, home of the Canada Centre, which many of you will know very well. And it was reported to us it was raining in Metula. Of course, that was not a meteorological event. It was Katyusha rockets raining down on the city. Hezbollah, a terrorist organization, trying to instill terror and to kill innocent men, women, and children in this small town in northern Israel. And I very naively asked, what does Canada do? When something happens, do we speak up? Do we issue a statement? Do we get up at the United Nations? Do we demand justice? Do we go on the record? And I asked the fellow conducting the briefing this question, and I'll never forget his answer. He said, this is back in 1993, he said, we don't get involved in these type of things. Because you know, John, it's hard to tell the white hats from the black hats. And I was surprised, and I grew to be stunned, and I sat there doodling on my pad of paper. White hats, black hats. The state of Israel, Hezbollah. A liberal democracy, a terrorist organization. Our best friend and our worst enemy. And it was at that moment that I realized that Canadian foreign policy needed to change, and needed to change in a big way. And if I said that if I could ever be part of bringing that kind of change, that kind of moral clarity, that kind of getting rid of this terrible notion of moral relativism, that I would do every single thing I could. And I'm so thrilled to have had the chance to get to know and to work with Stephen Harper and be able to deliver that kind of principled foreign policy to Canada. I fast forward many years, and in 2005, just before I got elected to the federal parliament, I was still a member of provincial parliament, a provincial politician, both literally and figuratively. And there was a group of young Canadians going to Israel, and there was a young leadership group, and they tried to bring a few Conservative and Liberal politicians with them. And they had 3 Liberal MPs lined up to go. And unfortunately, the Conservative Federal Caucus was entirely booked up. They had a caucus meeting, and it was a command performance, so no one could go. And I was asked, could you come? You know, it's a federal issue, but you're a provincial guy. Maybe you could find 2 friends. So I said I would absolutely love to. And could you bring 2 friends with you? We need 2 other provincial politicians. And I chose Jim Flaherty and Tim Hudak, people sitting with me in the provincial legislature who would fortunately go on to much better things. In Tim's case, I think going on to much bigger and better things in short order. But we went, and we had a great tour of Israel, got to work with these young people and to deal with them. And we're having a dinner at the Imbal Hotel outside on the patio. And we had the Canadian ambassador there, who's actually a great guy. I've come to work with him, and I quite respect him and like him. Not so on this night. And I'm very quiet and reserved in my ways. I don't normally speak up. Not really the case. But there was a lull in the conversation. I'm sitting right across from him, and I said, why is Canada so anti-Israel? Why does Canada always stand up at the United Nations and year after year after year always stand up and vote against Israel on so many of these resolutions that condemn the only liberal democracy in the region? 1/4 of all human rights resolutions at the United Nations are targeted against the only liberal democracy in that region. They said, well, they don't matter. It's the same ones every year. No one pays attention. I said, well, if it doesn't matter and no one pays attention, why does Canada vote so badly? And we went on and fought. And finally, I thought, well, I'm a guest in this country. I should perhaps shut up. Then Flaherty took the baton and started to go after him as well. And I got the sense that they felt they were dealing with provincial politicians, figuratively and literally. And how excited I was 6 months later to see this individual come into the cabinet room and seeing Jim Flaherty and I sitting on either side of Prime Minister Stephen Harper in an inter-cabinet meeting. And I'm not sure if they understood it, but things have changed, and have changed a lot since that time. Listen, my grandfather is someone who I tremendously respect. He left in 1942 to Europe. The great struggle, he was in the war, and then stayed in the Canadian Forces for 25 years after the war. And the great struggles of his generation, were fascism, and then in the Cold War, communism. Well, the great struggle of our generation is terrorism. And far too often, the Jewish people of Israel are on the front lines of that struggle. And we must never forget that. We simply cannot stand behind the Jewish people in the struggle. We must stand shoulder to shoulder with them, and that was certainly the case that we saw in the rocket attacks with Hamas this past 2 weeks. And it is not just that Israel has a right to protect itself. What other fundamental responsibility does any state have than to protect its own people? And this past 2 weeks have been incredibly difficult for the people of Israel as they've dealt with more than 1,000 or 1,500 rockets. And Canada has been one of the only countries who has unequivocally stood behind this great state. And I am tremendously proud of that. And again, I think if Mark was at this stage, if Joe was at the stage, they would say and know that it was the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper that led to that unwavering support. Israel is a remarkable place. It's a remarkable place because of the great society that they've built, the challenges that they have endured and responded to, the great ingenuity and innovation that has made Israel such a phenomenal place. And that didn't happen by accident. One of the great institutions which has contributed so much to that success, to that economic prosperity, to the vibrance which is Israeli society, is the Jerusalem College of Technology. And if you look at so many economic and scientific and innovative successes on so many of them, many of them. You can look back to graduates of the college who have made an outstanding contribution. And I want to say tonight two things. One, to say what a tremendous honor it is for me to receive this honorary degree, and two, what a tremendous gift that each and every one of you have given to the future prosperity and vibrancy of the Jewish state by being so supportive of this great institution here tonight. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.